Margaret stood motionless in her kitchen, the afternoon light filtering through lace curtains her mother had crocheted decades ago. The letter trembled in her hands. Hospital confirmation for tomorrow's kidney surgery. Not the paper that made her chest tighten, but Thomas's scribbled note beside it. Tournament too important. You'll manage. 30 years together, reduced to 5 callous words. Her fingertips traced their anniversary photo on the refrigerator, a tear sliding down her lined cheek, dropping onto the granite countertop with a soft pat. The mantel clock, a wedding gift, ticked accusingly in the silence. Have you ever been abandoned when you needed someone most? Share your story below, like if this strikes a chord. Follow to see how Margaret reclaims her dignity after betrayal. As she sank into a kitchen chair, memories of shared meals at this table twisted into a knot of betrayal in her stomach. The coffee she'd made for two grew cold, untouched. Margaret's hand trembled as she sorted through the day's mail in her sun-dappled kitchen. The afternoon light filtered through lace curtains, casting warm patterns across the oak table where 30 years of family dinners had unfolded. Her fingertips paused on a thick envelope from Memorial Hospital, final instructions for tomorrow's kidney surgery. A folded note slipped out, Thomas's hurried scrawl instantly recognizable. Tournament too important to miss. You'll manage fine. 5 words. 5 callous words. The clock on the mantel, their wedding gift, ticked loudly in the sudden silence. Margaret's breath caught as memories surged. Thomas holding her hand through her mother's funeral. Thomas laughing as they planted the garden. Thomas promising, in sickness and health, beneath the elm that no longer stood. Not you, she whispered, voice cracking. Her chest tightened as the first tear fell, darkening the hospital letterhead. Not after all these years. She clutched the edge of the table, her knees suddenly weak. The surgery wasn't simple. Dr. Kim had been clear about the risks. They'd discussed recovery plans for weeks. Thomas had nodded along, asking about recovery time while checking golf scores on his phone. Margaret sank into the kitchen chair, her mother's handkerchief pressed to her lips to muffle a sob. Her gaze drifted to the refrigerator where their anniversary photo hung beside pictures of Claire, their daughter, who'd stopped visiting after that terrible Christmas argument 3 years ago. Tears blurred her vision, but as she wiped them away, something caught her professional eye, the kind of detail she'd never missed during her decades as a hospital administrator. The hospital letterhead looked slightly off. She squinted, holding the paper to the light. The phone number differed from the one she'd been calling for appointments. Margaret straightened, her breathing steadying as suspicion sparked. She reached for her reading glasses, examining Thomas's note more carefully. The paper was from his golf club stationery, not the notepad he kept by the phone. Why would he use that, unless... The doorbell chimed, interrupting her thoughts. Margaret froze, handkerchief still damp in her hand. Who would be visiting the afternoon before her surgery? Thomas had mentioned something about the neighbor collecting mail while they were at the hospital, but that was before he'd apparently decided she'd manage fine alone. She rose slowly, the floor creaking beneath her slippers. For a moment, her reflection caught in the hallway mirror. Silver hair, lined face, eyes red-rimmed, but suddenly sharp with purpose. The hospital administrator, who'd managed crisis after crisis for 35 years, wasn't gone, just temporarily forgotten. The doorbell rang again, more insistent this time. Margaret's steps faltered as she approached the front door. She tucked the note into her cardigan pocket and smoothed her hair, a lifetime habit, before facing the world. The peephole revealed a familiar yet unexpected face. Claire, her estranged daughter, shifting nervously on the porch. "Claire?" Margaret's voice caught as she opened the door. The afternoon sun highlighted her daughter's features, Thomas's determined chin, but Margaret's observant eyes. "Mom." Claire clutched a small overnight bag. "I got your message about the surgery." Her gaze drifted past Margaret, scanning the entryway. "Where's Dad?" A fresh wave of hurt washed over Margaret. "He's not here." The words came out steadier than she felt. "Golf tournament." Claire's brow furrowed. "The day before your surgery. That doesn't sound like him." She stepped inside, the scent of hospital antiseptic clinging faintly to her clothes. Nurse's work, Margaret remembered. 3 years of silence hadn't erased her knowledge of her daughter's life. "Apparently it is like him." Margaret closed the door, buying a moment to compose herself. "Coffee's fresh if you'd like some." Back in the kitchen, Margaret watched her daughter move with clinical efficiency, setting down her bag, washing her hands at the sink. Just like Thomas, Claire had always been a doer rather than a talker. Unlike Thomas, Claire had shown up. "I tried calling Dad when I got your message," Claire said, accepting the mug Margaret offered. "Went straight to voicemail." "You didn't have to come." Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she eased into her chair. "I know things haven't been. You're having surgery, Mom." Claire sat across from her, in Thomas's usual spot. "Of course I came." The simple declaration broke something loose in Margaret's chest. A tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. "Thank you." Claire looked away, uncomfortable with the emotion. Her gaze fell on the hospital papers scattered across the table. With professional interest, she picked up the top sheet. "Mom, where did you get this?" Her nurse's eyes narrowed. "It came today. Final instructions." Margaret watched her daughter's face carefully. Claire shook her head slowly. "This isn't from Memorial. The letterhead's similar, but it's wrong." She pulled out her phone, scrolling quickly. "See? Different logo, different phone number." Margaret's suspicion crystallized into certainty. "I noticed that too." "And Dad's note?" Claire asked. Margaret handed it over wordlessly. As Claire read, her expression hardened in a way that reminded Margaret painfully of Thomas when he'd made up his mind about something. "He's been acting strange for weeks," Margaret admitted. "Distant, checking his phone constantly. I thought he was just worried about the surgery." Claire's mouth tightened. "Did you check your joint accounts recently?" The question hit Margaret like a physical blow. In 30 years of marriage, she'd never once worried about their finances. Thomas handled investments, she managed the household budget. Perfect teamwork, they'd always said. "Why would I need to?" Margaret began, then stopped as the implications sank in. "You don't think—" The house phone rang, interrupting her. The caller ID showed Thomas's cell number. Margaret and Claire exchanged a look loaded with 30 years of family history. "Let me answer it," Claire said, reaching for the phone. Margaret placed her hand over her daughter's. "No, I need to hear what he has to say." She squared her shoulders, the hospital administrator resurfacing. "And I need to decide what happens next." The phone felt unnaturally heavy in Margaret's hand. She pressed speaker so Claire could hear, then answered with a steadiness that surprised her. "Hello, Thomas?" "Margaret." His voice sounded distant, traffic noise in the background. "Just checking in before the tournament. How are you feeling about tomorrow?" Margaret's eyes met Claire's across the table. Her daughter's expression hardened, but Margaret gave a small shake of her head. "Not yet." "Nervous?" Margaret answered truthfully. "Dr. Kim went through the risks again yesterday." "You'll be fine." The dismissive tone was painfully familiar now. "Listen, I meant to tell you, I might stay an extra day if Jenkins invites me to the club dinner. Networking opportunity. Margaret watched the letter and note on the table, evidence of betrayal in black and white. 35 years of hospital administration had taught her to gather all facts before acting. When will you be at the hospital tomorrow? A pause. Too long. Well, that's the thing. The tea time is early, and with the drive back, I might not make it until evening. But you won't be awake much anyway, right? Claire's knuckles whitened around her coffee mug. Margaret placed a calming hand on her arm. I see, Margaret said, each word measured. And which hospital should the nurses call if there's an emergency during surgery? Another pause. Memorial, of course. Where else? That's what I thought. Margaret touched the falsified hospital letterhead. Thomas, is there something you want to tell me? About the tournament, perhaps? Or our bank accounts? The traffic noise suddenly disappeared, as if he'd moved somewhere quieter. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, harder. What have you been doing, Margaret? Finding things that don't add up. The administrator in her took control, the woman who'd managed hospital crises for decades, who'd made life-or-death decisions daily. Claire is here, by the way. Claire? Genuine surprise there. Why would she? Because someone should be with Mom before major surgery, Claire cut in, unable to remain silent any longer. And we've been comparing notes. Now listen, Thomas began. Margaret interrupted him, 30 years of trust crumbling with each word. I don't think I will listen, Thomas. Not anymore. I think I'll be checking our accounts instead, and calling Memorial Hospital to confirm my actual surgical schedule. She could almost see him calculating, adjusting. Thomas had always been quick on his feet, charming his way through difficult situations. Margaret, you're stressed about the surgery. Let's talk when I get back and— No. The word came out firm, decisive. I don't think we'll be talking then. I think you'll be explaining yourself to our lawyer instead. She ended the call before he could respond, her hand steady now. The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking clock. Margaret stared at the phone, then at the false hospital letter, the pieces falling into place with terrible clarity. He's been planning something, she said finally. This fake hospital letter with the wrong date. He wanted me confused about the surgery timing, and that note. She tapped Thomas's message. Insurance, perhaps. Proof he told me he was going away, if anyone asked later. Claire nodded slowly. Mom, we need to check your accounts, now. Margaret rose, moving to the small desk in the corner where she kept household records. Her hands were steady as she logged into their online banking portal. Thomas had insisted she have access, just in case, though she rarely checked it. The screen loaded. Margaret stared at the numbers, disbelief washing over her. He's been moving money, she whispered. Small amounts at first, then larger transfers to an account I don't recognize. She scrolled through transaction after transaction. For months, Claire leaned over her shoulder, professional assessment in her gaze. Classic pattern. Start small to test if you'll notice, then escalate. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, decades of memories flashing through her mind. The beautiful house they'd restored together, retirement plans for travel, grandchildren they'd hope for someday, perhaps if Claire ever— Her eyes snapped open. There was no time for regrets or might-have-beens. Tomorrow she faced surgery, and apparently a fight for her financial survival as well. Claire, she said, turning to her daughter with new resolve, I need to make some calls, and then I think we should pack a few of Thomas's things. Claire's eyebrows rose. Pack them? Margaret nodded, a plan already forming. The administrator, who'd managed crisis after crisis, hadn't disappeared with retirement. She'd simply been waiting. "Yes," she said, reaching for the phone again. "By the time he returns from his tournament, Thomas will find the locks changed and divorce papers waiting." Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, a spring storm approaching. Margaret felt an unexpected calm settle over her. The worst had happened. Thomas had betrayed her, and somehow she was still standing. The morning of her surgery dawned with pale light filtering through unfamiliar blinds. Margaret blinked awake in Claire's guest room, momentarily disoriented before yesterday's revelations came flooding back. Thomas's betrayal, the falsified hospital letter, the drained accounts. "Mom?" Claire appeared in the doorway, already dressed in scrubs. "It's 5:30. We should leave by 6 to get you checked in." Margaret nodded, swinging her legs over the side of the bed. Her body felt heavy, but her mind was surprisingly clear. "I'm ready." Claire hesitated. "Dad called again last night, after you went to bed." Margaret paused in reaching for her robe. "What did he say?" "That you're overreacting, that there's a perfectly reasonable explanation for everything." Claire's expression hardened. "He tried to convince me you've been confused lately. Said the doctor mentioned possible early dementia during your last checkup." A cold wave washed through Margaret. "He's setting the stage," she murmured, "creating a narrative. I know manipulation when I see it, Mom." Claire leaned against the doorframe. 3 years of silence, and suddenly he's concerned about your cognitive state. The day after you question him about missing money? Margaret stood, drawing herself up with dignity. The hospital administrator, who'd navigated thousands of crises, hadn't disappeared. She'd simply been dormant. "Let's focus on the surgery first. We'll deal with Thomas afterward." Memorial Hospital's pre-op area hummed with quiet efficiency. Margaret changed into a hospital gown, her belongings stored in a plastic bag that Claire tucked into a locker. As a nurse started her IV, Margaret found herself scanning for familiar faces from her administrative days. "Margaret Wilson?" A familiar voice drew her attention. Dr. Sarah Kim approached the bed, chart in hand. "How are you feeling this morning?" "Better than expected," Margaret replied honestly. Dr. Kim glanced at Claire, then back to Margaret. "I see your daughter is with you today. Not your husband?" "He had a prior commitment," Margaret said evenly. Claire's expression remained carefully neutral. Dr. Kim hesitated, then nodded. "Well, we've been through the procedure. Any last questions before the anesthesiologist comes in?" "Just one," Margaret said. "Yesterday, I received what appeared to be hospital paperwork with tomorrow's date for the surgery. A forgery, as it turns out." Dr. Kim's professional composure slipped momentarily. "A forgery? Margaret, that's deeply concerning." "Yes," Margaret agreed calmly. "My husband appears to have been planning something around my surgery. I've already called my bank and lawyer." The doctor's gaze sharpened. In her years as an administrator, Margaret had worked with Kim on several difficult cases. They shared a mutual respect. "Is there anything I can do?" Margaret considered. "Actually, yes. Could you document in my medical record that I was cognitively sound during this conversation? And perhaps note that I've made Claire my medical proxy, effective immediately?" Understanding dawned in Dr. Kim's eyes. She nodded briskly. "Of course. I'll have the forms brought in right away." After the doctor left, Claire sat beside the bed, her expression troubled. "Do you think Dad would really try to use your surgery to take control of your finances?" Margaret reached for her daughter's hand. "I don't know who your father is anymore, Claire, but I know who I am. And I won't be outmaneuvered." The next thing Margaret remembered was waking in recovery, the world hazy and distant through a veil of anesthesia. Claire's face swam into view, concern etched in her features. "Surgery went well," Claire said, noticing her mother's consciousness. "They got the entire tumor, no complications." Margaret tried to speak, but her throat felt raw from the breathing tube. Claire offered a small ice chip instead. "Dad's been calling the nurses' station," Claire continued quietly. "I haven't spoken to him, but I checked your phone. 17 missed calls and multiple texts asking where you are." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. So Thomas had returned from his tournament to find the locks changed and no wife at home. The bank accounts frozen, the note from her lawyer on the door. "He doesn't know which hospital you're in," Claire added. The fake letterhead had a different hospital name. "He's been calling around the city." A nurse approached, checking Margaret's vital signs. "How's our patient doing? Pain level on a scale of 1 to 10? 4, Margaret whispered, her administrator's instinct to appear strong still intact. The nurse nodded, adjusting something in her IV. "Your daughter hasn't left your side since you came out of surgery. You're lucky to have her." As the nurse moved away, Margaret found Claire's hand again. "Thank you," she managed. Claire's eyes glistened unexpectedly. "I should have been there sooner, not just today." The weight of their 3-year estrangement hung between them. The argument about Claire's career choices, the harsh words exchanged over Christmas dinner, Thomas taking sides, driving the wedge deeper. "We're here now," Margaret whispered. Claire nodded, squeezing her hand. "Mom, there's something else. I've been looking into Dad's recent activities." She glanced around, ensuring their privacy. "He wasn't at a golf tournament. He was with a woman named Melissa Grant. They've been seen together regularly for months." Despite everything, the confirmation of infidelity struck Margaret like a physical blow. 30 years of marriage, the vows they'd made beneath the elm tree in her parents' yard, all discarded for, what? A younger woman? Money? Freedom from caring for an aging wife? Margaret felt tears forming, but blinked them away. The clinical surroundings reminded her of her professional strength. As hospital administrator, she'd handled countless crises with clear-headed determination. This was just another crisis. "There's more," Claire continued hesitantly. "I found emails on his tablet. He left it charging at home in his hurry to leave. They've been planning to access your retirement accounts." The surgery was their opportunity. The pieces clicked into terrible clarity. The fake hospital paperwork to confuse her about dates. The sudden tournament to establish his absence. Perhaps even plans to claim she was confused post-anesthesia, unable to make financial decisions. "Dr. Kim documented your competency," Claire said, as if reading her thoughts. "And I've already spoken to the hospital's patient advocate. They're putting additional security measures on your records." Margaret felt an unexpected surge of pride in her daughter, the determined, capable nurse who'd stepped in without hesitation. Perhaps Thomas's betrayal had created space for healing elsewhere. A soft knock interrupted them. Dr. Kim entered, still in surgical scrubs. "The pathology is preliminary, but it looks good," she said. "Clean margins. We got it all." "Thank you," Margaret said, her voice stronger now. Dr. Kim's expression turned serious. "Margaret, security called up. Your husband is downstairs, demanding to see you. Quite agitated, apparently." Claire straightened, protective instinct flashing across her face. "He can't come up here." "He won't," Dr. Kim assured them. "I've restricted visitors to your approved list only, but I thought you should know." After the doctor left, Margaret lay back against the pillows, processing this new development. Thomas had found her. The confrontation she'd hoped to delay until after recovery was now imminent. "What do you want to do?" Claire asked. Margaret considered her options, weighing them with the clear-headed analysis that had made her an exceptional administrator. Despite the pain medication, her mind felt remarkably sharp. "Call security," she decided. "Tell them I'm willing to speak with him briefly, but only with a hospital security officer present." Claire's eyebrows rose. "Are you sure?" Margaret nodded, resolve strengthening. Better to face this now on my terms than wait for him to create more problems. Besides, she added with a ghost of a smile, I've spent 35 years managing hospital crises. This is familiar territory. As Claire stepped out to make the arrangements, Margaret adjusted her bed to a more upright position. The incision site throbbed, but the pain felt distant compared to the betrayal she'd endured. She smoothed her hair, straightened her hospital gown, and prepared herself for battle. Thomas might have underestimated her, but that was his mistake. Margaret Wilson had spent a lifetime being underestimated. As a female administrator in a male-dominated field, as a working mother, as an aging woman. Each time she'd proven her strength. This time would be no different. Thomas looked smaller somehow, standing awkwardly at the foot of Margaret's hospital bed. His golf tan contrasted sharply with the sterile whites and blues of the recovery room. A security officer stood quietly by the door, arms crossed, while Claire positioned herself like a sentinel at Margaret's side. "Maggie," Thomas began, using the nickname she'd always disliked. "What's going on?" "I come home from the tournament and find the locks changed. Some lawyer's note." "Don't!" Margaret's voice was soft, but carried the authority that had once silenced boardrooms. "Don't pretend, Thomas. Not anymore." He shifted, glancing nervously at the security officer before adopting a concerned expression. "Honey, you're not thinking clearly. The doctors warned me the medication before surgery might—" "Stop." Margaret held up her hand, the IV tube trailing from her wrist. "I was perfectly clear yesterday when I found the fake hospital letter, and when I discovered the money transfers from our accounts." Thomas's face changed, calculation replacing concern. "Those transfers were investments. I was going to surprise you." Claire made a small sound of disgust. Margaret silenced her with a gentle touch. "And Melissa Grant?" Margaret asked quietly. "Was she an investment too?" The name landed like a physical blow. Thomas's practiced composure slipped, showing genuine shock. "How did you know about your girlfriend?" Margaret finished for him. "Your tablet, Thomas. You left it charging at home." His eyes darted to Claire, putting the pieces together. "You had no right to go through my personal, like you had no right to drain our retirement accounts?" Claire shot back. Thomas's jaw tightened. "This is between your mother and me." "Not anymore," Margaret said calmly. "Not when you tried to use my surgery as an opportunity to take financial control. Not when you created fake hospital documents to confuse me about dates." "Maggie, be reasonable." "It's Margaret," she corrected, her dignity intact despite the hospital gown and IV lines. "And I'm being perfectly reasonable. The bank has frozen our joint accounts, pending investigation. My lawyer has filed for emergency financial protection, and Dr. Kim has documented my complete cognitive competence." Thomas's facade crumbled, replaced by something harder, colder. The charming husband disappeared, revealing a stranger Margaret barely recognized. "You think you've got it all figured out," he said, voice low. "But who's going to take care of you during recovery? Where will you even stay? You're 65 years old, with no income of your own." The words were meant to wound, to remind her of vulnerability. Instead, they strengthened Margaret's resolve. "I'll be staying with me," Claire said, stepping forward. And Mom has plenty of income. The pension you conveniently forgot about when calculating your exit strategy. Thomas's gaze flicked between them, reassessing. So you two have reconciled. How convenient. No, Thomas, Margaret said evenly. What's convenient was having a wife scheduled for surgery while you cleared out accounts. What's convenient was planning to claim I was mentally incompetent while you filed for control of our assets. The security officer shifted slightly, a subtle reminder of his presence. Thomas noticed, his expression darkening. You've always been dramatic, Margaret, making mountains out of molehills. I was protecting our investments, that's all. By sleeping with a real estate agent 20 years your junior? Claire asked bluntly. Thomas flushed. My personal life is none of your— It became my business, Margaret interrupted, when you used our marriage as a cover while plotting financial fraud. She took a deep breath, managing the pain that flared with the movement. 30 years, Thomas. We built a life together, and you were willing to discard it all, to leave me financially vulnerable during a health crisis. For a moment, something like shame flickered across his face. Then it hardened into defensiveness. You never appreciated what I sacrificed for that life. Working jobs I hated, playing the devoted husband while you built your precious career. Margaret absorbed the bitterness in his words, recognizing it had been there all along, hidden beneath charm and companionship. How had she missed it? Had retirement stripped away their carefully maintained facades, revealing the strangers beneath? I'm tired, she said finally. The surgery was successful, but I need to rest. Claire will be in touch with you through my lawyer. Margaret, please leave, she said quietly. If you ever cared for me at all, give me this dignity at least. Has betrayal left you wounded when you needed support most? Share your story below. Like if this pain feels familiar, follow to see how Margaret finds her strength when everything seems lost. Thomas hesitated, calculations visible behind his eyes. The security officer straightened, a silent message. Finally, Thomas nodded curtly. This isn't over, he said, but the threat sounded hollow. Yes, Margaret replied with quiet certainty. It is. After Thomas left, Claire sank into the chair beside the bed. Are you okay? Margaret closed her eyes briefly, feeling the weight of loss and betrayal pressing against her chest more painfully than the surgical incision. 30 years of shared history, tainted now by deception. The future she'd planned, suddenly a blank page. No, she admitted softly, but I will be. The medication pulled her toward sleep, but Margaret fought it briefly, reaching for Claire's hand. Thank you for being here. Claire's fingers tightened around hers. I should have been here sooner, those 3 years we lost. We have time, Margaret murmured, as sleep began to claim her. We'll make it right. As consciousness faded, Margaret found herself thinking not of Thomas and his betrayal, but of the hospital she'd managed for so many years. How many crises had she navigated? How many seemingly impossible situations had yielded to her calm, methodical approach? This was just another crisis, and Margaret Wilson had never yet met a crisis she couldn't handle. 3 weeks after surgery, Margaret sat in Eleanor Simmons's sunroom, afternoon light warming the space despite the early spring chill outside. Eleanor, her neighbor for 20 years and friend for even longer, poured tea into delicate cups that had belonged to her grandmother. He's been driving past the house again, Eleanor reported, settling into her wicker chair, slowing down, but not stopping. Margaret nodded, unsurprised. Since her discharge from the hospital, Thomas had maintained a strange orbit around their former life, close enough to observe, but careful not to violate the temporary restraining order her lawyer had secured after his confrontational hospital visit. "The bank investigator called yesterday," Margaret said, accepting the tea. "They've traced most of the transfers. Thomas and Melissa were planning to buy property in Arizona." Eleanor's eyebrows rose. Retirement dreams without the retired wife? Apparently. Margaret's tone was matter-of-fact, the initial shock of betrayal having settled into something more manageable, a dull ache rather than a sharp wound. "They've frozen the accounts he opened in his name, only my lawyer thinks we can recover most of the funds." "And how are you feeling? The incision healing properly?" Margaret touched her side automatically. "Much better. Claire checks it daily, probably more often than necessary, but I don't mind." Eleanor smiled. "She's making up for lost time. Speaking of which, what's this I hear about a gathering at the senior center tomorrow? Sounds like Margaret Wilson is rejoining the land of the living." The observation was gentle but direct, typical of Eleanor's straightforward manner. Margaret had been quietly withdrawing from social activities in recent years, she realized. A gradual retreat she'd barely noticed. Had Thomas encouraged that isolation, preparing the ground for his eventual betrayal? "Robert Jenkins is organizing it," Margaret explained. "A welcome-back gathering, he called it, though I suspect it's also a show of community support. Word about Thomas has gotten around." Eleanor snorted. "Small wonder. Melissa Grant isn't exactly discreet. They've been seen together all over town for months." The casual revelation stung less than Margaret expected. "Were they that obvious? How did I miss it?" Eleanor reached across to pat her hand. "Because you trusted him, dear, as you should have been able to do after 30 years of marriage." Margaret sipped her tea, considering. "Claire thinks I was too absorbed in hospital administration all those years. That I saw what I expected to see at home, not what was actually happening." "Perhaps," Eleanor allowed, "but that doesn't excuse his actions. There are honest ways to end a marriage." The conversation shifted to community news, the spring festival planning, renovations at the library, Eleanor's granddaughter's college acceptance. Normal life continuing, despite Margaret's world having tilted on its axis. As Eleanor cleared the tea things, Margaret found herself studying the collection of photographs on the sunroom shelves. Eleanor with her late husband Frank, their children at various ages, grandchildren, a visual timeline of a life well lived. "I've been thinking," Margaret said, as Eleanor returned, "about what comes next." "Naturally." Eleanor settled back into her chair. "You've always been a planner." "The house is too big for one person, and it holds too many memories now." Eleanor nodded, understanding. "Thinking of selling?" "Eventually." Margaret straightened, decision crystallizing as she spoke. "But first, I'm going to renovate. Make it mine before I decide whether to keep or sell it." A slow smile spread across Eleanor's face. "Starting with Thomas's precious den, I hope? That dark cave with all those golf trophies?" Margaret laughed, a genuine sound that surprised them both. "Actually, yes. Claire's already taken down most of his memorabilia. I'm thinking of turning it into a reading room, light colors, comfortable seating. Margaret Wilson reclaiming her space," Eleanor approved. "What else? The garden needs attention. Thomas never understood why I kept my mother's roses." Margaret's gaze drifted to the window, where Eleanor's own carefully tended flower beds showed the first signs of spring growth. "And I've been talking with Robert about volunteering at the senior center. They need help reorganizing their medical information sessions." Eleanor studied her friend with knowing eyes. "The hospital administrator emerges again. Old habits, Margaret acknowledged with a small smile. But useful ones, apparently. Robert says several members have been victims of medical insurance scams recently. I might be able to help navigate those situations. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Claire, who let herself in with the key Margaret had given her. These past weeks had bridged much of the distance between them, though they were still finding their way back to the easy relationship they'd once shared. "Sorry I'm late," Claire said, cheeks flushed from hurrying. "Emergency at work." She set a bag of groceries on Eleanor's counter. "I brought dinner ingredients. Thought we might cook together tonight, Mom." Margaret felt a rush of affection for her daughter. Claire had been staying at the house since Margaret's discharge, sleeping in her old bedroom as if the 3 years of estrangement had temporarily collapsed. They both knew it was temporary. Claire had her own life, her own apartment across town, but the rekindled connection felt like a precious gift amid the wreckage of Margaret's marriage. "Sounds perfect," Margaret said, rising carefully from her chair. "Eleanor, will you join us?" As they gathered their things to leave, Eleanor pulled Margaret into a gentle hug. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. "Frank always said you were the strongest woman he knew." He was right. The mention of Eleanor's late husband, who had died with dignity after a long illness, Eleanor by his side until the end, highlighted the stark contrast with Margaret's own marriage. One partner had honored his vows, the other had calculated his escape. Back at the house, Margaret had stopped thinking of it as theirs. Claire moved efficiently around the kitchen, unpacking groceries and setting out ingredients for dinner. Margaret watched from the table, struck by how her daughter's methodical approach mirrored her own. "I spoke with Dr. Kim today," Claire said, washing vegetables at the sink. "She's pleased with your recovery, says you're healing faster than expected." "Good genes," Margaret replied. "Your grandmother was the same way. Bounced back from everything life threw at her." Claire turned, leaning against the counter. "Including betrayal?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with shared history. Margaret's mother had weathered her own marital crisis decades earlier. A brief affair that had nearly ended her parents' marriage. They had reconciled, rebuilt, carried on until her father's death 15 years later. Different circumstances, different choices. "She found her way through," Margaret said carefully. "As we all do." Claire nodded, turning back to dinner preparations. After a moment she spoke again, her voice deliberately casual. "Dad called me today." Margaret felt her body tense involuntarily. "Oh?" "He wanted to know how you were doing, if you needed anything." Claire's knife moved steadily, slicing carrots with practiced precision. "I told him your lawyer was the appropriate contact for any concerns." "Thank you." Margaret smoothed the tablecloth, a wedding gift from Thomas's mother. Another memory requiring recontextualization. "Did he say anything else?" Claire hesitated. "He asked if you were planning to drag his name through the mud at the senior center tomorrow. Apparently Melissa's mother is a member there." Margaret absorbed this new information with surprising calm. "Interesting that he's concerned about his reputation now. I told him that, unlike him, you had too much dignity to create public drama." Claire set down her knife, facing her mother fully. "But privately, I hope you destroy him." The fierceness in her daughter's voice brought unexpected tears to Margaret's eyes. "That's not my goal, Claire." "Why not? After what he did?" "Because anger would keep me tied to him," Margaret explained gently. "I want freedom, not vengeance." Claire considered this, her expression softening. "When did you get so wise?" "Oh, I've always been wise," Margaret said with a small smile. "You just weren't listening for a few years." The joke, tentative but genuine, broke the tension. Claire laughed, returning to dinner preparations with lighter movements. As Margaret set the table, her mother's china that Thomas had always considered too old-fashioned for regular use, she felt a curious sense of lightness despite everything. The house that had felt suffocating in those first days after discovery now hummed with new possibilities. Walls could be repainted, rooms repurposed, gardens replanted, lives rebuilt. "Claire," she said, an idea taking shape, "what would you think about moving the home office upstairs? I was thinking of converting it to a guest room, for when you visit." Claire looked up, surprise and pleasure crossing her face. "I'd like that," she said simply. Outside, spring rain began to fall, gentle and cleansing. Margaret listened to its rhythm on the roof, the same sound she'd heard through decades of storms in this house. But for the first time in months, it didn't sound lonely. It sounded like renewal. Margaret paused at the entrance to the Oakwood Senior Center, suddenly hesitant. Through the glass doors, she could see familiar faces gathered in the main hall, neighbors, former colleagues, friends from various chapters of her life. Robert Jenkins, the center's director, was arranging chairs in a semicircle, his military-precise movements unchanged since retirement from the Army 20 years ago. Having second thoughts, Claire asked beside her, car keys still in hand. Margaret smoothed her jacket, a new purchase, blue instead of the beige Thomas had always preferred. "Just gathering myself." This would be her first public appearance since the surgery, since Thomas's betrayal had become common knowledge. Small towns had few secrets, and the dissolution of a 30-year marriage qualified as significant news in Oakwood. "Remember what Dr. Kim said," Claire reminded her gently. "Don't overdo it. An hour, tops." Margaret nodded, squaring her shoulders. "I spent 35 years walking into hospital board meetings where I was the only woman present. I can handle a few well-meaning neighbors." Trust shattered by someone you loved. Comment your moment of standing tall, like if you found your courage. Follow to witness Margaret's powerful step back into community after betrayal. They entered together, the room quieting momentarily before erupting in warm greetings. Eleanor appeared immediately, taking Margaret's arm as if the gesture were casual rather than supportive. Robert approached with a dignified nod that conveyed more respect than effusive words could have. "Margaret, you're looking well." His handshake was firm, reliable. "We've set up refreshments in the library if you'd prefer somewhere quieter." "Thank you, Robert, but I'm fine right here." Margaret's gaze swept the room, noting familiar faces. And who was missing? "I understand you've been organizing some health advocacy sessions?" "Trying to," he admitted. "We've had several members fall victim to insurance scams recently. I've been thinking your expertise might be invaluable when you're fully recovered." Margaret felt a flicker of purpose, the administrator in her responding to a clear need. "I'd like that. Perhaps we could start planning next week?" Eleanor guided her to a chair, strategically positioned to minimize standing. Around them, conversation resumed its natural flow. Claire drifted to the refreshment table, giving Margaret space while remaining watchful. Judith Parker, who had taught with Thomas for 20 years before their respective retirements, approached hesitantly. "Margaret, dear, it's so good to see you up and about." The concern in Judith's eyes held a question she was too polite to ask directly. Margaret appreciated the restraint. "Thank you, Judith. I'm recovering well. Claire has been staying with me." Judith nodded, glancing toward Claire. Such a blessing to have family close during difficult times. The gentle emphasis on family spoke volumes. Judith had been among the first to welcome Margaret to Oakwood when she and Thomas moved there as newlyweds. She had witnessed their entire marriage. Yes, Margaret agreed simply. It is. More neighbors approached, offering support in the form of casserole promises and garden assistance. Margaret accepted graciously, conscious of the unspoken sympathy beneath practical offers. These people had known Thomas, had considered him a friend. His actions had betrayed not just Margaret, but an entire community's trust. Robert materialized at her side again, this time with a troubled expression. Margaret, I should warn you, Evelyn Grant just arrived. Melissa's mother. Margaret felt Claire tense beside her, having returned with a cup of tea. Across the room, a slender woman in her 70s stood near the door, her expression a complex mixture of defiance and discomfort. It's fine, Robert, Margaret said calmly. Evelyn has been a member here longer than I have. This is her space, too, Eleanor snorted softly. The nerve of that woman showing up today. Her daughter's choices aren't hers, Margaret pointed out, surprising herself with the lack of bitterness she felt. Besides, she's probably as blindsided as I was. Claire's eyebrows rose slightly at her mother's composure. Margaret smiled faintly, patting her daughter's hand. The hospital administrator, who had mediated countless conflicts between doctors, nurses, and administrators, had not disappeared. She had simply been in hibernation. As the gathering continued, Margaret found herself drawn into conversations about the community garden project, the upcoming local election, the library renovation fund, normal life continuing despite personal upheaval. There was something profoundly comforting in that continuity. She was discussing the garden committee's plans for a children's section when she became aware of Evelyn Grant standing nearby, clearly working up the courage to approach. And the conversations around them quieted, anticipation hanging in the air. Margaret made it easier for her. "Hello, Evelyn." Evelyn looked startled at the direct acknowledgement. "Margaret, you're looking well." "Thank you." Margaret kept her voice even, neutral. "How are you?" The simple courtesy seemed to throw Evelyn off balance. She had clearly expected hostility. I'm managing. I wanted to say," she faltered, glancing around at the watchful audience, "this situation isn't what I would have wanted for anyone." Margaret nodded, recognizing the closest thing to an apology the proud woman could offer in public. None of us anticipated where we would find ourselves at this stage of life. Something passed between them, a recognition of shared vulnerability despite their circumstances. Both women in their 60s, navigating unexpected terrain, forced to remake their understanding of family. "No," Evelyn agreed quietly. "We didn't." After a moment's hesitation, she retreated, leaving Margaret at the center of impressed murmurs. Eleanor squeezed her arm in silent approval. "Mom," Claire said softly, "that was incredibly gracious." Margaret sipped her tea, surprising herself with her own equanimity. "Anger takes too much energy, Claire. Energy I need for healing." The gathering continued for another half hour before Margaret began feeling the fatigue Dr. Kim had warned about. Claire noticed immediately, another benefit of having a nurse for a daughter, and smoothly initiated their departure, fielding well wishes and follow-up invitations. In the car, Margaret leaned back against the headrest, physically tired but mentally invigorated. "That went better than I expected." Claire navigated through Oakwood's quiet streets toward home. "You were amazing. I don't think I could have been so composed if I were in your position." "Practice," Margaret said. "Years of hospital crises teach you to separate personal feelings from necessary actions." They drove in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Claire spoke again. "Robert seemed quite taken with your ideas for the health advocacy program." Margaret smiled, recognizing her daughter's observation for what it was, an acknowledgement of Margaret's continuing value beyond her marriage. He's a good administrator, recognizes expertise when he sees it. As they turned onto their street, Margaret caught sight of a familiar car parked several houses down. Thomas, watching from a distance. Claire noticed too, her hands tightening on the steering wheel. Want me to confront him? Tell him to stop this surveillance nonsense? Margaret shook her head. No need. My lawyer is filing the final divorce papers tomorrow. The financial settlement is nearly complete. She gazed at the distant figure in the car, feeling an odd detachment. He's looking at the past. I'm focused on the future. They pulled into the driveway of the house. Her house now, Margaret reminded herself. The garden was showing signs of renewal, spring bulbs pushing through soil. Margaret had recently turned. Inside, the walls of the former den were now a soft sage green instead of Thomas's preferred dark wood paneling, the heavy curtains replaced with light-filtering shades. Small changes. First steps. As Claire unlocked the door, Margaret glanced back toward Thomas's car, now pulling away from the curb. 30 years of shared history driving into the distance. The pain was still there, but increasingly it was accompanied by something else, a growing certainty that what lay ahead might be better than what was left behind. I'm thinking of getting a cat, Margaret said, as they entered the house. Something else that wasn't possible with Thomas's allergies. Claire laughed, hanging up their coats. One step at a time, Mom. Maybe finish the renovations first? Margaret smiled, moving toward the kitchen to start dinner. Through the window, she could see the garden waiting for attention, the rose bushes her mother had given her as a housewarming gift 30 years ago, still standing despite seasons of neglect. Like Margaret herself, they had survived, and with proper care, they would bloom again. The lawyer's office gleamed with sterile efficiency, divorce papers arranged in precise stacks on the polished conference table. Margaret sat beside Mrs. Harmon, her posture perfect despite the surgical recovery, while Thomas and his attorney occupied chairs across the divide. 6 weeks post-surgery, 4 months since discovery, and Margaret felt unexpectedly calm facing the man who had shared her life for 3 decades. We're here to finalize the divorce settlement, Mrs. Harmon stated crisply. The financial forensic investigation has been completed, and the court has approved the proposed division of assets. Margaret listened as the lawyer detailed what they already knew. Thomas's attempt to hide assets had been documented and reversed. The house remained hers. Her pension stayed untouched. The joint savings Thomas had attempted to transfer had been returned to her control. Signatures were exchanged with striking contrast. Thomas's harsh and quick, Margaret's deliberate and steady. The lawyers stepped out briefly, leaving them alone for the first time since the hospital confrontation. You look well, Thomas offered awkwardly. The surgery was successful? Completely, Margaret replied evenly. His fingers tapped restlessly on the closed folder. Margaret, I want you to know that Melissa and I don't need to know about your relationship, she interrupted gently. That chapter is closed for me. His expression hardened. Just like that. 30 years dismissed without a backward glance? No, Thomas, she said quietly. I look back every day. I remember the good years and acknowledge the pain of how it ended, but I'm not defined by either the marriage or its dissolution. He looked genuinely puzzled by her composure. The community has taken sides. Robert canceled my membership at the center. Eleanor crosses the street to avoid me. Margaret sighed. People make their own judgments. I haven't encouraged anyone to ostracize you. But you haven't discouraged it either, he pointed out. No, she acknowledged. Your actions had consequences beyond our marriage. That's not my responsibility to manage. The lawyers returned, concluding 30 years of marriage in less than an hour of paperwork. Outside, Margaret was surprised to find Claire waiting beside the car. "Switched shifts," her daughter explained with a small smile. "Thought we might celebrate, or commemorate. Whatever feels right." As they drove away, Margaret glimpsed Thomas standing alone on the steps, watching their departure. For a moment, she felt the full weight of what had been lost. Then she released it, turning her attention to Claire's description of plants for the garden renovation. At Riverside Cafe, overlooking the water, Claire raised her glass. "To new beginnings," Margaret smiled, "and renewed connections." "I've been thinking about moving back to Oakwood," Claire said. "I've applied for a transfer to the community hospital." Emotion welled in Margaret's throat. "Claire, I don't want you making decisions based on concern for me." "It's not just about you," Claire assured her. "It's about what I want too. Being home these past months has felt right." Eleanor joined them briefly, sharing gossip about Thomas and Melissa hitting quite the rough patch now that his finances had adjusted. "Mom doesn't need to hear gossip about Thomas," Claire frowned. But Margaret placed a calming hand on her daughter's arm. "I wish them both well, whatever they decide." After Eleanor left, Claire regarded her mother with admiration. "You really meant it about not being bitter." Margaret watched a sailboat navigate the river current, adjusting to changing winds with graceful precision. "Bitterness would only bind me to pain. I'm interested in freedom now." The truth was both simple and complex. The betrayal had wounded her deeply, but had also broken chains she hadn't recognized were binding her, the compromises that had gradually eroded her preferences, the slow diminishment of her voice in her own home. "Besides," Margaret added with a small smile, "living well truly is the best revenge." 1 year after surgery, Margaret stood in her garden, pruning shears in hand, surveying the transformation around her. The overgrown hedges Thomas had neglected were now neatly trimmed. Her mother's heritage roses bloomed vibrantly against the newly painted white fence. Stone pathways wound through beds of perennials selected for continuous color and minimal maintenance. Practical beauty, much like Margaret herself. "The seniors' bus will be here in 20 minutes, Claire called from the porch, checking her watch. "Need help finishing up?" Margaret smiled, removing her gardening gloves. "Just about done. The garden's ready for its debut." Today marked the first meeting of the Oakwood Senior Health Advocacy Group, Margaret's brainchild, born from her own experience and nurtured through months of planning with Robert Jenkins. The initial gathering would take place right here, in the garden that had become a symbol of her renewal. "Hard to believe it's been a year," Claire remarked, helping her mother gather the gardening tools. Margaret nodded, glancing at the house, her house now, inside and out. The sage-green reading room that had replaced Thomas's dark den. The kitchen renovated with the granite countertops she'd always wanted. The spare bedroom converted into Claire's weekend space, used regularly since her daughter's return to Oakwood. The doorbell chimed. Eleanor arrived first, bearing a tray of lemonade for the meeting. "Garden looks magnificent," she declared, setting down her offering. "Frank would have been impressed by those trellises. Thomas never could build a straight structure." Margaret smiled at her friend's loyalty. "Let's not spend the day comparing my ex-husband's shortcomings. We have more important matters to discuss." "Indeed we do," Eleanor agreed. "Robert says we have 15 seniors signed up already for the Medicare navigation sessions." Within the hour, the garden filled with neighbors and community members. Robert efficiently arranged chairs in the shade while Margaret distributed information packets she'd prepared, drawing on decades of healthcare administration experience. Several attendees shared stories of medical billing confusion or insurance denials. Exactly the issues Margaret's program aimed to address. As she guided the discussion, Margaret caught Claire watching from the porch steps, pride evident in her expression. Their relationship had healed alongside Margaret's body and heart, stronger now for having been tested and renewed. Midway through the meeting, Margaret noticed a familiar car slowing on the street. Thomas driving past as he occasionally still did. But this time, instead of lingering, he continued on, perhaps finally accepting that this chapter had closed for both of them. Margaret had heard through Oakwood's efficient grapevine that Melissa had ended their relationship shortly after the financial settlement. Thomas had eventually sold his condo, moving to a neighboring town where his past wasn't common knowledge. She wished him peace, sincerely, if distantly. When the meeting concluded, Eleanor and Robert stayed behind, helping clear chairs and glasses. "This was a triumph," Robert declared. "The Community Health Center director wants to partner with us. Says your program could be a model for other towns." Margaret nodded, satisfaction warming her. "I'll draft a proposal next week." After their friends departed, Claire joined her mother on the porch swing, a new addition Margaret had installed last fall. "You've built something remarkable here," Claire said, gesturing toward the garden where ideas and connections had taken root alongside the flowers. "Not just the advocacy program, everything." Margaret squeezed her daughter's hand. "We build what we can from what we're given." As twilight settled over the garden, Margaret rocked gently on the swing. 1 year ago, she had faced surgery, betrayal, and an unknown future. Today, she sat surrounded by beauty she had created, purpose she had discovered, and relationships she had nurtured. Thomas had broken their marriage, but in doing so, he had inadvertently freed Margaret to become fully herself, stronger, more authentic, and ultimately more content than she had been in years. Sometimes, she reflected, the greatest renewal comes after the deepest hurt. Her garden proved it. Her life confirmed it. When trust shatters, it sounds like glass breaking in an empty house. You know that sound, don't you? That moment when a letter, a text, a careless word reveals the betrayal you never saw coming. Margaret stood in her kitchen, surgical papers in hand, reading the callous note from a husband of 30 years, and perhaps you nodded in recognition. We've all had our hearts broken by those we trusted most. There's something particular about betrayal in our later years that cuts deeper than youthful heartbreak. The stakes feel higher when you've built decades together. When the garden you've tended holds 30 years of memories. When the kitchen table has hosted countless family dinners. When retirement plans suddenly evaporate like morning dew. The tears taste saltier somehow, weighted with all those shared yesterdays and the tomorrows you'd counted on. You've been there, haven't you, folks? Standing in your own kitchen or sitting in a quiet den, wondering how to rebuild when the foundation cracks beneath you. The fear whispers, "Is it too late to start over?" The doubt creeps in. Who am I without this relationship? The world feels suddenly too large and too small all at once. Margaret felt it too, that disorienting vertigo of identity, when 3 decades of we suddenly becomes I. But here's what Margaret discovered, and what you might recognize too. The wisdom earned through years doesn't abandon us in crisis. It sustains us. The skills honed over decades don't disappear with betrayal. They become our tools for rebuilding. Margaret's professional expertise as a hospital administrator became her compass. Your life experience is no different. A well of strength deeper than any heartbreak can reach. The porch swing, where Margaret eventually found peace, might look different for you. Perhaps it's a garden bench, a favorite chair, the seat of a car driving toward a new horizon. But that moment of quiet clarity, when the tears finally dry and you recognize your own reflection again, that belongs to all of us who have weathered storms and found ourselves still standing. The heart, like an old house, can be renovated. Rooms that held pain can be reimagined. Gardens that withered can bloom again. And the person who emerges, a little more weathered perhaps, but infinitely more authentic, is worth every tear shed along the way.